The apple stretching. Homosexuality was not illegal in New York City in the 1960s. It just seemed that way. The New York State Liquor Authority had long insisted that merely by serving drinks to homosexuals, a bar was maintaining a disorderly house, which the SLA could and would then close. It embarked upon a particularly aggressive series of such license revocations from 1959 through the mid-1960s. Only in 1967, after constant agitation by a handful of openly gay campaigners, were New York bars allowed to knowingly serve homosexuals without prosecution. When, the next year, a state judge decreed that same-sex couples dancing together were not breaking the law, it may have seemed that the tide was finally turning. Yet the New York Police Department continued to enforce an arcane and degrading law that required people to wear at least 3 items of gender-specific clothing in public. In addition, the police policy of entrapment extended beyond the solicitation of gay prostitutes on the street and frequently involved the arrest of young men on the dance floor. This discrimination and victimization did not deter gay nightlife. Rather, it sent its potentially lucrative customers into the clutches of the people who knew how best to profit from it, the mafia. In Greenwich Village, always Manhattan's prime gay neighborhood, the scene's clubs and bars were divided almost equally between the Gambino family, who ran the Washington Square, Purple Onion, and Tony Pastor's, and the Genovese family, the 10th of Always, the Bonsoir, and the Stonewall Inn. Few of these venues ever had all the correct licenses, but the police were known to turn a blind eye in exchange for regular payoffs. To keep up appearances, the 6th Precinct would occasionally launch token raids, typically tipping off the club owners in advance. After the routine demanding of ID, partly to degrade and arrest patrons who had dressed as members of the opposite sex, and a bout of homophobic name-calling, the police would leave, and the bar club would resume its activities. Neither the police nor the club owners ever expected the patrons to protest. Where else, after all, were queers, faggots, or fairies, as they were most commonly referred to in public, permitted to flaunt their lifestyle? Of these various village bars, the Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street, almost from its opening night in March 1967, proved the most prominent. An insalubrious double storefront, the Stonewall's windows were painted black and boarded on the inside, and its decor consisted simply of 2 connected rooms, each with a dance floor and a bar, one with the bonus of a few booths. The Stonewall clientele, according to one of its regular customers, Wayne Rogers, later to become Jane County, who had frequented the club since arriving in the city from Atlanta in 1967, included drag queens, hippie queens with long hair down to their shoulders, butch lesbians in men's shorts, and a few straight people. And by the way, when I do that, that's my kind of like I'm quoting people, so it's in quote marks in the book, just so you know. Also in the mix were teenagers, blacks, Puerto Ricans, and whites alike, who fell under the late 60s terminology of flame queens, favoring body-hugging male clothing with teased hair and eye makeup, and who attracted chicken hawks, older gays, out to seduce them. Ostensibly a members-only club, one of the means by which the mob could circumvent SLA requirements, the Stonewall's customers would typically sign in under idolized names like Judy Garland, Diana Ross, and Joey D. Once inside, they were encouraged to head straight to the bar, where drinks were watered down and glasses refilled with only a cursory rinse in a dirty vat, there being no running water behind the bar. Stolen goods, drugs, and sex were all readily traded under the watchful eye of Ed the Skull Murphy, a career criminal and veteran gay club manager who also oversaw activities at the nearby Juice Bar, the 10th of Always, where the clientele was yet younger. The drinking age in New York at the time, by the way, was 18. Being alcohol-free, the 10th of Always could let in those even younger. Well known for his own fondness for chicken, Murphy was embroiled in various prostitution rings and alleged to be behind the permanent disappearance of at least one of the young Stonewall regulars. Despite all this, the Stonewall afforded a certain degree of shelter, especially for the homeless kids who slept in Christopher Square across the street. And many of the young gays admitted that the seediness of the place added to its attraction. But what really distinguished the Stonewall was the freedom to dance without harassment, something not found in other gay village bars. The Stonewall's twin dance floors were fed by a jukebox, and in June 1969, when the club was subjected to a police raid that would have major repercussions on gay rights and dance music alike, that jukebox was stocked in equal parts by Motown, like The Young Folks by Diana Ross, contemporary hippie hits, Aquarius, Let the Sun Shine In from Hair, dramatic camp, In the Ghetto by Elvis Presley, girl groups, You Came, You Saw, You Conquered by the Ronettes, and straight-up dance instrumentals, Grazing in the Grass by Friends of Distinction. There were several reasons why the raid early on Saturday, June the 28th, proved atypical. For one, it was a ferociously hot midsummer's night on which a full moon rode high in the sky. For another, it was already 1:20 a.m. when the music was halted, peak hour for New York's weekend revelers, when hormones are typically raging and grievances well fueled by drink and drugs. In addition, it was the second raid on the club in 4 nights, the 6th precinct having apparently made one of its token incursions earlier in the week. The funeral of the gay icon Judy Garland had taken place in Manhattan earlier that day, some 22,000 people filing past her coffin in just 24 hours, adding to the foreboding atmosphere. And the raid itself was far from routine, having been launched by detectives of the 1st Division, a higher authority. We knew the 6th precinct wasn't very effective in keeping these bars properly controlled, the raid's leading detective, Deputy Inspector Seymour Pine, said years later. We didn't tell them we were going to raid the bar. Only once inside the club, having halted the music and seized the cash registers, did the officers call the local precinct for backup. The detectives then began inspecting IDs and checking gender. At least 3 drag queens and 1 particularly butch lesbian were arrested for cross-dressing. The others were released slowly, one by one, onto the street outside, where the atmosphere turned into something between a carnival and a protest. When the butch lesbian, a passing woman by other terminology, was placed inside one of the 6th precinct's police cars, she delighted onlookers by proudly exiting from the other door. When bodily handled back into the car, she fought back physically. That was the moment, said Jim Farrat, the hippie gay activist who avoided the Stonewall for its chicken hawk reputation but found himself walking down Christopher Street that night on his way home from Max's Kansas City. That was the flashpoint when people suddenly became conscious that they had power. First coins, then stones, and finally bottles and garbage began raining down on the police. This came as a surprise. Gays were typically seen, by police, mafia, and media alike, as incapable of defending themselves. But the street kids / flame queens of Christopher Park had long ago learned to fight, quite literally, for survival, and they were the ones leading the attack. While they tried, unsuccessfully, to turn over the police vehicles, Pine's 1st Division detectives took the unprecedented step of barricading themselves inside the Stonewall. Those on the street smelled the cops' fear and began ripping up loose concrete paving stones as weapons. A parking meter was even freed from the sidewalk and turned into a battering ram on the Stonewall's front door. The oak door, reinforced with steel for just such an attack by the police, held. Inside, Deputy Inspector Pine was about to give his officers permission to discharge their weapons when he heard sirens signifying backup. This was the Tactical Patrol Force, the same police who had cracked so many skulls at Grand Central Station a year earlier. That was when the Yippies came out and there was a big riot at Grand Central Station. But this time they found themselves on the receiving end of a rearguard challenge by the young Stonewall Queens. As the battle became a temporary free-for-all, Pine emerged briefly from the Stonewall to grab the nearest protester, arresting none other than Dave Van Ronk, the distinctly heterosexual folk singer who had broken from a Friday night of typically drunken revelry at the nearby Lion's Head to see what the fuss was all about. The streets finally cleared shortly before 4 a.m., but the crowds returned to Christopher Street to confront the police the following night, and again the next, by which point a different gay crowd, that which spent summer weekends on Fire Island, had returned to the city to learn that it had missed out on a historic occasion. Ronnie DiBrienza, a 26-year-old bisexual who had been inside the Stonewall that Friday night, put it best in the following week's East Village Other. The gay people are the last people anyone ever suspected would violently demonstrate for equal rights. Well, let me tell you, baby, you just don't fuck with the gays anymore. Literally speaking, discotheque translates as record library, which is how the French originally intended it. More flexibly, it came to be understood as a night spot where people danced to records played from a turntable rather than a jukebox. Under such definitions, the first New York discotheque would surely have been the stately named Le Club. Opened by the wealthy Parisian scion Olivier Coquelin on Sutton Place on New Year's Eve 1961, Le Club featured Slim Hi-Hats spinning records to an uptown crowd that paid a hefty annual membership fee for the privilege. The club became an immediate hit with the Jet Set, the new term for the former cafe society who, thanks to transatlantic passenger flights, now included aristocratic Europeans as well as wealthy Americans, and who favored French chansons and Italian ballads in addition to American rhythm and blues. The Jet Set could also be found in the early 60s at the Peppermint Lounge or at True de Hellas, though at both venues the spinning of records still took second place to residencies by the likes of New York's all-girl group Goldie and the Gingerbreads and the ubiquitous Joey D and the Starlighters. I call them ubiquitous because they've already been mentioned in about 3 other chapters. Then came Arthur. Founded in 1965 by the Welsh miner's daughter Sybil Burton when her actor husband swapped her for Elizabeth Taylor. Funded by a who's who of $1,000 investors that included Leonard Bernstein and Julie Andrews, and named for George Harrison's haircut in A Hard Day's Night, Arthur, at 54th and 2nd, rode a perfect cultural wave, part British invasion, part New York melting pot, and equally popular both with aspiring hipsters and with the coveted Jet Set. Like his contemporaries, Arthur relied heavily on a house band, the Wild Ones, but it also boasted a disc jockey, Terry Noel. A former Peppermint Lounge dancer and consummate record collector, Noel liked to talk of the feeling the crowd emanates, like an unconscious grapevine, and he became arguably the first New York nightclub DJ to serve as something other than a human jukebox. By the end of 1965, Midtown was filled with French-themed discotheques and British invasion nightclubs alike. L'Interdit, Le Directoire, the Phone Booth, and Ondine, the fashionable status of which was amplified by the fact that the Animals' Eric Burden enjoyed his first acid trip there, courtesy of the Stones' Brian Jones, while under the protective custody of the rising photographer Linda Eastman. In April 1966, Olivia Coquelin and Adlai Stevenson's son, Borden, opened Cheetah near the old Palladium on Broadway in 53rd, and the stakes were raised further. Cheetah's opening night included 200 models sporting both the flowery images of Carnaby Street and the vinyl suits of downtown Manhattan, cylindrical changing rooms hung from the ceiling, a Nathan's vendor cruising the 8,000-foot dance floor, and a series of side rooms offering television broadcasts, avant-garde movies, and even, for those for whom the sensory overload was too much, a library. It's kind of funny reading this while, we're in the library. It's I guess, plus ça change, you know. A crucial shift back downtown came when the Undine promoter Bradley Pierce signed on to Salvation, located in the former Cafe Society space on Sheridan Square. And earlier in the book, we talked about Cafe Society, which was sort of started by John Hammond and featured Billie Holiday and all the folk singers. So one of the common themes, tangentially here, is the way these venues keep reinventing themselves. So what used to be a folk club becomes, one of the kind of first discotheques. Under Pierce's popular jurisdiction, Salvation became another celebrity haunt, attracting the likes of Liza Minnelli, Mia Farrow, and Faye Dunaway. But unlike the more fashion-conscious Midtown clubs with their strict, though rarely admitted, quotas, it welcomed the local gay clientele too. Also contributing to Salvation's status was Terry Noel's presence as disc jockey. Until the night he arrived late for work once too often to find his place on the turntables taken by a former dancer from Trude Helens, whom he had previously dismissed as a mere groupie, Francis Grasso. Grasso, from Brooklyn, and 19 years old at the time, differed from Noel in 2 key areas, and they were enough to alter the entire direction of New York nightlife. First was his refusal to see the disc jockey as a support system for the club's liquor sales. Where Noel would regularly throw on slow records to encourage visits to the bar, Grasso worked instead to keep the dancers on the floor, all the time building momentum, taking listeners on a lengthy, sensual journey towards a memorable musical climax. Nobody had really just kept the beat going, he said years later. They'd get them to dance, then change records. You had to catch the beat again. It never flowed. In addition, Grasso played essentially black music. Where Terry Noel had favored the Mamas and the Papas, the Doors and the Rolling Stones, Grasso took the Stones and the Doors' heavier cuts as a launching pad into the heavy white groups who aspired to sound black, the psychedelic side of Motown, the emergent anthems of Sly and the Family Stone and the Chamber Brothers, and the ongoing dance sermons of James Brown, the undisputed king of soul who was held in especially high regard in New York for his seemingly constant appearances at the Harlem Apollo and the live album recorded there. The jet setters were on the way out, and Grasso helped show them the door. It was not mere coincidence that on June the 21st, 1969, 1 week before the Stonewall raid, Arthur closed for good, sold to a consortium led by Bradley Pierce, who announced the intent of turning it into a perfectly ungroovy supper club. Pierce had vacated Salvation by then, wisely so, for as Salvation became ever more popular with the local gay crowd, it simultaneously became beholden to mobster muscle. Francis Grasso was spinning there the night of June 27th, 28th, when the Stonewall was raided. He recalled that the management locked the doors amid the violence, not only to keep the crowd outside from coming in, but especially to keep the crowd inside from coming out. For as graffiti that showed up within hours on the Stonewall's exterior spelled out, "Gay prohibition, corrupt cops, feeds mafia." With the Stonewall temporarily shuttered in the weeks after the raid, the police had, among other things, taken an axe to the bar. The Gambino and Genovese families moved in together on Salvation's putative owner, Bobby Wood, a former used car dealer from the Bronx who, lacking other options, decided to keep a detailed record of his payoffs to police and mob alike and of on-premises thefts and drug deals. In December 1969, the State Liquor Authority, clearly having its own misgivings about the operation, suspended Salvation's liquor license, but the club merely slipped into juice bar mode and kept right on doing business. Then, in February 1970, Wood showed up dead on a side street in Queens, his body riddled with bullets. Just a few days later, a letter from the grave was handed over to senior law officials. In it, Wood named the mob figures who had wrestled control of the club and 2 detectives who had shaken him down for $8,000. "Should I meet with a violent death or disappear, certainly one or a combination of these men are responsible," wrote Wood, who also referenced mafia intimidation of John Addison, operator of the Together discotheque on 59th Street. Yet business continued unabated. By the summer, the Stonewall's lease had been transferred to a Gambino representative, Nicholas DiMartino, who had also just reopened Salvation as the Haven, the ultimate teen club. At the Haven, he brought back Francis Grasso, who was soon joined by 26-year-old Steve DeCristo, a long-haired cab driver who stopped in one night on a customer's recommendation and was instantly converted to the music. And then Michael Capello, just 16 when he first started hanging out at the Haven. The three became best friends. Part of a cultural continuum that stretched back to the doo-wop era's similar fascination with black music, Grasso and his Italian-American friends were not necessarily connected. But the experience of shared cultural and neighborhood backgrounds made them an obvious first line of employees on the ever-growing gay club circuit. David DePino, for example, grew up on Mulberry Street in the heart of Little Italy, where one of his neighbors, an Italian roughneck named Nicky Falco, went on to become the frontman for Tamberlane, a dance club inside a Chinese restaurant on the busy stretch of 48th Street. There, Falco employed DePino's older sister, who brought David to see the club for himself when he was only 16. DePino recalled of his first night at the club, the entranceway of which featured a bridge over a pond full of goldfish, that he felt like Alice in Wonderland. Inside, he found guys humping guys, girls kissing girls, and the music blasting and lights blinking. Tamberlane, as DePino discovered, was really gay. It was crazy, it was loud, it was over the top, the drugs were rampant. But there was yet a more crucial distinction. "I always went to little neighborhood places with bands," he said. "Music always stopped. Jukeboxes always stopped. But this music was continuous. I remember looking over to my sister's friend and saying, 'This song's been on for an hour. It's the longest song I've ever heard.' She said, 'No, it's the DJ playing the music.'" That would have been Steve DeCristo, who had seized a residency upon Frankie Grasso's recommendation. Grasso himself soon progressed to the Sanctuary on West 43rd Street between 9th and 10th Avenues, a former German Baptist church situated appropriately, given that it had previously displayed a mural of the devil engaged in sexual activity with multiple angels in the heart of Hell's Kitchen. In a brief late 60s existence, the church, as it was then known, had a liquor license and enforced a couples-only policy. But as the Sanctuary, fronted by Seymour and Shelley, a pair of flamboyant gay promoters who fronted a number of popular after-hours and/or gay bars from the village to Midtown, it downgraded to juice bar status and shifted sexual allegiance accordingly. At the Sanctuary, all the ingredients for the new decade's dance clubs came together. It had a mixer, said Joey Madonia, 16 years old in 1971, when he was brought to the club by his Brooklyn neighbor, Frankie Ramos, the proprietor of the influential Manhattan store, Downtown Records. It had turntables. It had a light show. It had a sound system. It had a DJ booth. The DJ booth was in the center. It was on the altar. For the Catholic-raised David DePino, that was enough to provoke a religious experience on his first visit. He recalled dancing to the music of Grasso when suddenly the room went pitch black and everybody screamed and all the stained glass windows were lit from the outside. That took you into a whole other world and you realized, I'm really in a church. I was shocked. I was amazed. I felt guilt. I felt every emotion at the same time. I was overwhelmed. And I said, I have to be here for the rest of my life. Within weeks, a 17-year-old DePino, having figured out he was gay, had secured a job working behind a juice bar on the dance floor, which was surrounded on both sides by church pews that rose up to the stained glass windows. Few people ever spoke about the Sanctuary without talking about Francis Grasso. The two became intrinsically connected to each other's legacy. Such was Grasso's unprecedented influence over his audience that Joey Madonia, for one, frequently found himself approaching the altar to find out what was playing. The Sanctuary was the only club where every record was good, he said. He set about collecting everything Grasso ever played there. Grasso, a heterosexual in a mostly gay scene, was not, by modern standards, an underground disc jockey. His playlist at the Sanctuary was wide and varied and relatively mainstream. He still played white rock music, from the Doors to the James Gang to T-Rex and Chicago Transit Authority. He bought heavily into the cross-cultural experiments like Mitch Ryder's Detroit-Memphis experiment. He played gospel and R&B. There was James Brown, Grasso named Hot Pants, released in the summer of 1971 at the peak of Sanctuary's reign, as one of the most popular records he ever spun. Likewise, there was no shortage of the equally prevalent Midtown, that label itself reaching with arms outstretched into the musical possibilities of a new decade. And Grasso was an early fan of acts that were, at that time, still filed under R&B, New Jersey's Kool and the Gang and Chicago's Earth, Wind and Fire. But if Grasso became best known for any one style, it was his love of African music. He championed Osibisa, a group of Ghanaian and West Indians living in England, whose eponymous 1971 debut album produced the Sanctuary hit Music for Gong Gong. And he dug back in time to reintroduce the music of Babatunde Alatunji, an African percussionist living in New York, whose Drums of Passion, a major hit upon his 1959 release, included the seminal Sanctuary cut, Jingo Loba. To keep the groove going all night long, Grasso taught himself how to beat mix. Working with singles that featured parts 1 and 2 on separate sides, for years James Brown didn't release them any other way. He would use the state-of-the-art mixer's new cue systems to splice the beats together from one turntable to the other to create, he hoped, a seamless segue. Soon he was doing so mid-song. Joey Madonia recalled him extending the short drum break in the middle of Steam's 1960 #1 single, Na Na Hey Hey, Kiss Him Goodbye, switching from one turntable to another and back, a habit that would later take hold in the parks of the Bronx. When it came to records of different tempos, Grasso figured a segue point in his headphones, one record playing in each ear. The Thorin's turntables at the Sanctuary did not allow for any kind of speed control. Given the lack of recorded evidence, we can only guess at the true precision of the mixing. But by playing for several hours at a stretch, the Sanctuary often didn't close until late morning. Grasso learned to teach, read, and react to his audience. I always played according to what I got from the crowd, he said. If I saw them maintain the level of intensity, then I'd bring in a quicker record. It always depended on the vibe. Sanctuary's reputation ensured that it was chosen for the nightclub scene when Hollywood came to New York to make the movie Clute, starring Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda. Grasso recalled the hiring of real hookers and clubgoers as extras, and such flagrant drug use that the police showed up. Indeed, the ecstatic environment that Grasso created nightly often demanded gratification that could not be found on the dance floor, and as sexual acts spread in the street in the early hours of the morning, the Sanctuary generated unprecedented public attention. By March 1972, the state district attorney was calling for its closure. The end came, predictably, not long afterward. And I'm going to just read from a footnote about Clute, because this one actually tells you something about New York City at the time. And it's kind of, I kind of like this one. Now I'm going to jump to another chapter. So Clute's Sanctuary scenes show the club much as described in this chapter. The Clute DVD comes accompanied by the movie's promotional mini-film of the era, in which Donald Sutherland speaks of New York City as if it were a third world country. I think anyone who comes here for the first time is initially appalled. The air is impossible to breathe. There's too many people and it's compressed too tightly. And I was awestruck by the areas of degradation and alienation and squalor. So, you know, that's New York, I guess, in the 1970s. Saturday night.